So what is the major-minor system? Well, the major-minor system is basically a system of tonality. Now, when I say tonality, let's make sure you understand exactly what I mean. The characteristics of tonality are basically a key center, consonance and dissonance, and a hierarchical arrangement of notes or harmonies that lead to a central note. For most people growing up hearing mainly Western music, you may not realize you hear tonality, but you do. If I were to play this, I will bet that your mind is just itching for me to play the next note. And then when I play this, well, it just leaves you feeling unfulfilled. Now, there are several reasons for this, but ultimately, I think the main one is because it's what you're used to hearing. You see, tonality is built around the major and the minor scales, and that's why we call it the major-minor tonality. Now, that last scale I just played was a C major scale, but I ended it with a C sharp. Now, let me play the whole scale from start to finish. Doesn't that feel much better? This scale is fundamental to all tonal music written from about the 1600s to today. The other important scales are the minor scales. Now, I won't go over minor scales in detail right now, as they'll be covered later in another lesson. So I'll just quickly play them so you know that there are more than one minor scale. The first one is the natural minor scale. The next one is the melodic minor scale. And then the last one is the harmonic minor scale. Okay, so let's get back to the major scale. The major scale is made up of 7 notes, and then it repeats the first note an octave up at the end. Now, in this case, we're looking at the C major scale. So we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then C. Now, there are a few things that you should know about the major scale which are important for composers. First, each note has a degree name and number. The scale degree number is written on top with a little caret over the number, and below I put the Roman numerals used for each scale degree, which will become a little bit more important later on. Now, like I said, each scale degree has a name. The first note is called tonic. The second note is called supertonic. The third is called the mediant. The fourth is called the subdominant. The fifth is called the dominant. The sixth is called the submediant. The seventh is called the leading tone. And then the eighth is the tonic again, and we actually call that the octave. It's important to remember these names as they are also the names of the chords built on top of them. And we'll cover chords in just a little bit. Now, the other important characteristics of scales is the discrete pattern of whole step and half step intervals that a major scale has. And these intervals are melodic intervals, meaning that they happen one at a time and they're not stacked on top of each other. Let's back up for a second, though, and look at one of those modes that I talked about earlier. Now, when I was talking about the modes, I said that they followed all the white keys on the piano. But the reality is there were no keyboards and no pianos the way we know them back then. No, what they were actually following was a specific pattern of whole steps and half steps. Now, each mode had a different pattern, but the number of whole steps and half steps was always the same. There were basically 2 whole steps, then a half step, then there was 3 whole steps, and then another half step. Now, where that pattern began is really what determined the mode. So if we go back to the Dorian mode, you started on a D, you had a whole step, and then immediately a half step. And then, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, whole step. So that's what gave us the Dorian mode. With the Phrygian mode, you had, for instance, the first one was a half step. And then with the Lydian mode, you had 3 whole steps. That's basically what gives each mode a distinctive sound. Now the specific order that I said first, the whole step, half step, whole step, half step, is known as the Ionian mode. And it started to become popular for two specific reasons: the major third and the leading tone. Now the first two intervals, a whole step and a whole step, meant that the third was major. And that's what gives it that kind of upbeat, happy sound. Versus the Dorian, where you had a minor sound. Now the next important aspect was the half step from the 7th note, the leading tone, up to the 8th note, the octave. That half step became very important for determining the mode and eventually became fundamental to how music worked. So the pattern, once again, is the whole step, half step, whole step, half step, or 2 whole steps, a half, 3 whole steps, and then a half. This is basically what gives you the major scale and what gives it its unique sound. Okay, so we've seen the scale, and now let's talk about chords. Now chords come from the scale, and the most basic type of chord is the triad. A triad is formed by stacking 2 intervals of a third on top of the first note, or whatever note you're starting with. So when I say a third, I'm talking about 2 notes on a scale that are separated by 1 note in between. And if we take a look at the C major scale again, if we're starting on the note C, a third above C is E, and then a third above E is G. That's what I meant by thirds, and that's just what happens to be the first triad, the tonic triad. And it's called the tonic triad because it's built off of the tonic scale degree, or scale degree 1. And just as there are 7 scale degrees, there are also 7 main triads in a major scale. And each chord has a different sound, either major, minor, or diminished. Tonic is major. Supertonic is minor. Mediant is minor. Subdominant is major. Dominant, built off of the 5th scale degree, is major. Submediant is minor. The leading tone is diminished. And then, once again, we're at the octave. So that's major. And just as with the scale degrees, it's important that you know these chords cold. If I were to say to you, what's the subdominant, you need to know that it's a major chord built off of the 4th scale degree.